Cool. Bum, bum, bum. 29.
Hello.
I am
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Same, thank you.
Hi, Kayla. Hi, David.
Hello, Professor.
Nada de nada dala. Kayla, have you been to the moon? Is that why you're wearing your shirt?
No, I got it from Kohl's at Fair Lakes where I work.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really cool jacket. It's just a sweatshirt. It's very nice.
That's true.
I love it.
Yeah. You need to work at the Kohl's in Herndon. My son and I just went over there and had to spend some money. I could have spent money with you.
That's a little bit of a drive for me.
There is a and Chrisia.
Hi.
How are you guys?
Good, how are you?
I have no complaints openly.
Good.
All right, so we are getting ready for a what 3-day weekend, huh? What is going on with Kayla?
Sorry, that's my best friend. She decided to come over today.
Oh, okay.
So she might like pop up every now and then.
I just saw the skeleton come up. Okay, all right. Welcome
Yeah,
to the
that's my friend
class.
Meg.
Hello.
Welcome to the class. All
Thank you.
right. Hi, Helene.
Professor, are we having class on Monday?
No, it's Labor Day, so there are no classes on Monday. So you guys will have a 3-day weekend. I will only have a 1-day weekend. I've got to teach 2 of the classes on Saturday and Sunday. Yeah, I know, it sucks to be me. But life is short. All right, so let's see. Oh, Isabella's trying to get in. Good morning, hi then. Oh no, that's right, it's afternoon. It's been a long day. Okay, so we were on chapter 1, I believe. And in chapter 1, we had gotten through or gotten to the point where we looked at, and correct me if I'm wrong, we looked at the left side of Erickson's psychosocial tasks. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. So we'll pick up from there and we'll talk about the right side and the kind of developmental issues that can happen since we talked about those on the left. So those on the right, when we look at Erikson, again, there are 8 stages, but we're only covering 6 of them here. Erikson said that not unlike Freud, not unlike Piaget, he said that there are certain periods on average that we're going to go through, and as a result of going through those particular periods, it's going to affect us developmentally. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. All right, she called it. All right, so because they're developmental things, it goes from infancy all the way to emerging adulthood. So emerging adulthood, as you can see here, I would say emerging adulthood is probably 22 to 27. It can deviate plus or minus a couple of years, but the emerging adulthood, because adolescent and emerging adulthood, it generally takes us from one stage of puberty into that area of independence around 19, 20, 21. And then even if we look at the social structures, at least in the US, 21 becomes sort of the legal age when you are now held accountable for your own actions and your parents are no longer responsible. So on the right side of Erikson's stages, he said, well, we're either going to gain trust or we're going to gain mistrust. And when I say gain, it's not necessarily for anything that we have done, but it's the nature of our caregivers. And as a result of the interactions that we have with our caregivers, we're either going to feel like we are protected, that we have security, that our basic needs are being met, or we're going to feel like we are isolated and alone and that no one really cares. And if that's the case, then it establishes this sense of mistrust.
Is that
Now,
strictly nurture?
I'm sorry?
Is that strictly nurture?
Yeah, this is mostly nurture, yes. This is mostly nurture. Now, there can be just an ounce of nature in that if there were, during the birthing stage or the embryonic stage, if somehow drugs or something like that were introduced to your system where there is a natural predilection, a genetic predilection toward association with other people. And this is a partial reach, not a long reach, but even autistic folks have a basic trust with those who are in their immediate group, but then have a distrust for people who aren't in that group. So it can be genetic, but most of it is nurture and is as a result of social and environmental issues.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. So the mistrust then, because basic trust leads into autonomy, and remember we said autonomy was this level of independence where I felt like I could actually do things on my own. And if you think of kids, especially toddlers, it's when they try to walk, they want to feed themselves, you know, they don't want to be fed, they want to be the big boy or the big girl. Well, if they aren't trusting where they can make a mistake and it be recovered, or if they're going to do something they are protected from that, then that mistrust leads into shame and doubt. So now that shame and doubt is the opposite of independence. Now they're afraid of doing things without permission. There's actually a fear of taking risks. And because they haven't been given approval to do those particular things, they shy away from them because they feel like they don't have value. They aren't valued. They're frowned upon. You've seen some kids, and fortunately it's not prevalent, but when you first go to school, you see some kids who automatically isolate themselves and feel like they don't fit in. Well, that's part of this developmental cycle of mistrust manifesting itself into shame and doubt. And then, of course, if shame and doubt, if they don't feel that value, then they're, rather than taking risks, they're afraid of taking risks. So that guilt comes from an inability and the indecisiveness around making a decision. They really do feel guilty about even taking a risk because they didn't get permission, they didn't get approval. And of course, if it goes south, meaning it's not successful, they really take ownership of that, and it can affect them psychologically, because now that feeling of inferiority sets in. I don't deserve, I shouldn't have, I can't have, I won't have, it's not for me. So that guilt, that feeling that they don't have value leads into an inferiority complex. And notice on the other side is those who are willing to take risks, initiative and industry. They actually take their gifts and then apply those in much more situations. And they're willing to, if you think of entrepreneurs are more industrious and take initiative because they aren't afraid of failing. They think of what is going to be the better outcome as opposed to thinking about what's going to be the negative. Those who have an inferiority complex live by Murphy's Law. Well, if it can go wrong, it's going to, because I didn't deserve to have this. It's never going to work out for me. I'm not the right person. I don't have the right size. I don't have the right looks. I don't have the right whatever. And then, of course, as a result of not really having that level of confidence and awareness, it develops into role confusion. So what am I supposed to be when I grow up? What kind of career will I be good at? Will I be good at anything? What is my role in a relationship? Should I look for someone who will always take care of me? Or should I look at someone who's going to control me? So that role confusion manifests itself not just as a gender specific, it's about how we approach life. And if in your role, you feel like that you don't deserve, that you don't know where you fit in, it is difficult then to have a relationship. And because the nature of that isolation, before isolation, role confusion, the nature of that is that people aren't going to accept me or treat me with any kind of respect. So subsequently, it leads a lot of people into isolation. And not just because they don't feel like they don't fit in, but because now they're afraid of fitting in. If I go over with this group, they're just going to ridicule me, talk about me, make me feel bad. Well, rather than allowing that to happen, what I can do is isolate myself, and then it can't happen. So it becomes a protective measure as well. So Erickson says we go through, either we're going to go through the left or the right. And some of you, I think, may be thinking this, or I'll answer the question as we go. These are not cut in stone, right? So Erickson does say that we go from one stage to the next. However, we can always go back to a previous stage and overcome that. So we can change what we've developed into by going back and addressing what was the underlying issues that caused us to feel that way. Right? So that's the idea. So Erickson says, well, as we go through that, we're going to develop normally, and or what is considered normal from social standards, or we're going to have these developmental issues, and those are generally supported by the very beginning, which was a level of mistrust that led into these other issues. Very seldom will you have something on the right and then establish yourself on the left. First, you have to address those things on the right before you can achieve those on the left. Any questions there? Thoughts, comments? Okay, so that was Erickson. The next person is Piaget. So Piaget was, again, one of the founding psychologists, or in that. He looked at the way that we learn, developmental psychology. He looked at the way that we learn. And he says there are really three stages. Now, the two that we will talk about here, or that at least are shown on the screen, are assimilation and accommodation, and I'll talk about those. But there's also, before we start to assimilate or accommodate, we have to first develop a schema. And a schema is simply how we initially define something, how something works, and or our view characteristically of what something is. So if we have those two things, then it helps us define what we believe so that we can recognize it in its true form, or at least in the form that we believe it to be. So the first is a schema. And once you have that schema, and I will draw this because I saw a really good example of this, so I'm going to share it with you. I will own that it's not mine, but I think it's a really good example. So the idea was, so let's say that someone is reading you Dr. Seuss or whatever it is. And out of Dr. Seuss, you get this idea of what a dog is. I know it looks like a horse, but this is a dog. All right, so this dog, so your schema, waggly tail, of a dog is that there are, right, there are 4 legs, a tail. What else might be for a dog?
Ears.
Ears. Yeah, so pointed ears. So that may be as much as I need, because if they're reading a book and showing me pictures, you know, there's not always sound associated with it. So for right now, my schema of a dog consists of 4 legs, a tail, and pointed ears. All right, so that becomes my view. And you remember that kids, that once they learn a dog has 4 legs, a tail, and pointed ears, and when they see a horse, they say, oh, that's a big doggy. Right, so that's their schema of anything that has 4 legs, a tail, and pointed ears. Well, Freud says the way that, not Freud, I'm sorry, Piaget, the way that we assimilate is that we take the core construct of our schema, and then we acknowledge additional characteristics that have to be verified. So let's look at this example that I'm talking about with the dog. So the kid goes and has learned that a dog has 4 legs, a tail, and pointed ears. So now they go to the park, and they get to the park. The dog, he sees an animal with a tail, 4 legs, and pointed ears, but then something else happens. The dog barks. So now the dog barks, but it says, wait a minute, that's not a part of my schema, that dog barking. So it will validate it by maybe asking the parent or someone else and say, well, I know a dog has those things, but does a dog also bark? Well, assimilation is taking your existing information and then modifying it with new information. So now mom or dad says, yes, a dog also barks. And then the little dog comes over and licks the kid. So now the kid is, and again, when we look for things, we look for balance. Well, these two things create the absence of balance. There's disequilibrium. So as a result, the kid doesn't know that this fits in with his schema or her schema of the dog. So he says, the dog has licked me and it barks. Is that what a dog does? If it is verified, then the kid adds that, right, assimilation, takes the existing information that he or she had, and then adds this to it. So that's called assimilation. So a child continues to learn and associate its schema till it becomes almost unique. So I know the difference between a dog and something else. All right, but the initial schema still exists. So now while the kid is at the park, the cat comes up. And now the kid sees it, but it says, well, wait a minute. It's also got 4 legs and it's got a tail. So is that also a dog? And says, well, wait a minute. Let me apply. Well, it's got 4 legs, it's got a tail, it's got pointed ears. So check. It fits that of a dog. But then the cat meows instead of barks. So now that assimilated schema goes against what the kid says should be representative of a dog. And he says it doesn't fit. And then the cat can additionally climb a tree that a dog doesn't do, is not part of that schema. And so the kid says, well, now I can take this information, but I do accommodation by recognizing the difference between the original schema and the information. And now the new information applies differently. So I can still take the initial schema, the 4 legs, tail, pointed ears, but now it doesn't fit with the other information for a dog. And so now as a result of the difference, asks the parent, what is that? Oh, it's a cat. Right. So now the schema starts for a cat. So whenever a child now sees 4 legs, tail, pointed ears, and instead of barking, it meows, now they associate that it's a cat. So the assimilation is taking existing information and adding new information to it. Accommodation is taking that information, but then recognizing the difference between one schema and another and creating new information out of that difference. Okay, so Piaget said children throughout their learning will do those kind of things, and that's how they create additional knowledge. Now, as we looked at previously, sorry, two people are waiting to come in. As we looked at previously, the development, cognitive development, it's dependent on certain aspects of that psychology. And so here are 2, 4, 6, 8, and you can look at how these are similar yet different. You can notice almost all of them at least have some form of nurture associated with them, except evolutionary and behavioral genetics. And genetics primarily because genetics are external or can be external, usually external, to social and environmental involvement. So behaviorism, what reinforces, shapes the individual's behavior. Social learning, how does the environment impact me? What am I learning and how do I see that? Self-efficacy, remember self-efficacy is our belief and our confidence in the ability to achieve tasks. The psychoanalytic, back to the unconscious. What are the things, the unresolved conflicts, the needs and urges that someone is afraid to consciously display? Attachment theory, as we talked last week or last Monday, what is the attachment? Is it parental? Is it siblings? Is it other caregivers? And how do they cause a particular reaction and series of responses to them? All right. Evolutionary, how might this behavior be built into human genetic code? And how does it sustain the longevity, even if it's in our lineage? Behavioral genetics versus behaviorism. Behaviorism is about the reinforces or stimuli for the behavior. Genetics are causing the same behaviors or the shaping of behaviors. And then Erickson, those 8 stages, but we looked at 6 of them. You know, what are those levels of development? Are they positive or negative as it relates to the chart? And then last, Piaget, you know, how does this child create schemas and recognize the things that exist in the world and even do assignments of be afraid, don't be afraid. Think about it, even though it's not children, animals have intuitive fears of certain things. And then they don't have intuitive fears for others. Well, they need to know that from birth. So what is the difference? So that's why Piaget tends to pick out the children, because sociologically, a lot of their influence is sociological and is also environmental, cultural, and spiritual, and whatever else. Okay, so those are the differences. Now, the ecological developmental systems approach is, if we look at the developmental cycle or for children and recognize that there are impacts that adults and other people can have on that child, then we can deal with it from a reality perspective and not from a pessimistic perspective that it will never change. So someone asked either Monday or Tuesday, you know, were parents really responsible for a child's developmental issues that are non-genetic? And my response was yes. However, my response was yes from ages 3, actually birth, to around the age of 5. Because then, as we said before, if it's tabula rasa for a child, they're a blank slate, then the influences that they receive from their external environment helps them to determine what is going to be right, wrong, positive, negative, good, or bad. And so that's the idea. And we're going to look further, because this is Brockenbrenner's approach. And he says that as we look at one spectrum of life, it expands and gets influenced by others as we develop and grow. So here's Brockenbrenner's ecological model. So, and I actually have something because I wasn't satisfied with what they had here. And I made a note. Let me see where I made the note because I'm going to share it with you guys. I think if I find it. If I don't find it, then we'll do it next time around. Oh no, here we go. All right. Well, this will be good enough for now. All right. So what they're showing here is really just 4 stages or 3, and with a 4 level, a sub level within that, but there are actually 5 or 6. But since the book is only displaying it this way, we'll talk more specifically about how this is an impact. So at the beginning stages, the influence initially is simply going to be families, mostly going to be family. So the way that family establishes culture, acceptance, non-acceptance, those things are going to influence how a child sees his or her part and his or her position in that particular microcosm, which is the family. As a child gets older, and even before we go to the classroom and peer group, the religious part of it, right? Because there are very strong religious concepts in families. Not all of them, but those that do have a very structured view in how religion plays a role in life. And subsequently, the child is introduced to that at a very early age. They see how their parents interact. They see, whether they pray or whether they don't pray. They see how they treat other people as opposed to not treating people well. And that becomes a part of their formal upbringing. And then, of course, as they get older, a little bit older, then the classroom, because within the classroom establishes norms as well. Social norms, societal norms, and then as a result of those, their peers, the people that they hang out with, absolutely have an influence on how that child sees the world and where his or her satisfaction is related to those peers. And that's all a part of this initial microcosm. And then as we start going to adolescence and looking at health and those kind of issues, then we are more susceptible. Disney and Nickelodeon and all of those channels specifically target kids between the ages of 6 and adolescence, and maybe some a little after that, because media also creates a perspective. And since it creates a perspective, if it is seen regularly, then a child may assume that that is the norm. Maybe their family is the only one different. But if that's depicted as the norm for society and the way people are supposed to interact, then that must be right. The number of kids that I've seen and become aware of that watch some of these shows, and the kids automatically yell and scream at the parents and in some instances use certain words. And so when they interact with their parents, they use those same things, thinking that is correct. There was one instance, and it's a bad instance, but it's real, that the family loved watching WWE or WWF, whatever the wrestling thing is. And so, of course, there was the belief that, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen it, but you see it, people get hit over the head with chairs. I mean, they are thrown out of the ring onto metal tables, or what are supposed to be metal tables. They've been put in all of these environments, and then before it's over, they find resilience, they come back, they win the match, right? And then, of course, next week, you see the same person with no cuts or bruises or anything. Well, as children are looking at this, they're assuming that, oh, you don't get hurt doing this kind of stuff. So one kid, about 11 or 12 years old, got his little brother, 4 years old, and decided to do a power bomb. So he put his little brother on the floor. He gets up on the sofa, jumps off, and then slams his little brother. Well, it kills him. Well, this child had no idea that there was realness to these kind of actions because the media portrayed it as not being that dangerous. Medical institutions, right? So medical institutions, the introduction of serums and vaccines and all of these things promoting that if you do this, you will be healthy. If you don't, you won't. Right? So medical institutions start to play a role in our health and how we see the number of people now who are vegetarian, which is a good thing, I think. But vegans, you know, a lot of that was promoted because of medical institutions saying, oh, this is good for you, this is bad for you. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. School system, again, there are policies and procedures that people are conditioned to. And so they learn that the nature of the social order is to adhere to those conditions. And if you violate those conditions, there are implications and repercussions. And then, of course, your community. Boston and Chicago are probably the two highest, most highly segregated cities in the country. And it's because people develop communities of like thought, ideas, and what their perspectives are, and then they disallow other people to participate. Well, if you grow up in that community, you start to share those same views. And so subsequently, as an adult, you learn what is right, wrong, indifferent, and, you know, it's an example I was just reading, literally reading before the class, but I think it was Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, the protesters during a Black Lives Movement matter, the protesters were on the ground with their hands in the air, and the police, and I'm not against police, guys, so please don't take it that way, but those who were a part of the police force then went in and pepper sprayed them and did tear gas. The same day, there was a group of non-protesters who were armed with bats and weapons and knives and said that they were there to protect the community. And so the police did nothing. Right? So a lot of that is conditioned by what we believe is right and how we will address social order. And I'm not saying either is right or wrong. And again, I'm not against the police force. My brother and my first cousin police officers. But the idea is that if you are in a different community, even the police can respond differently. Protesters can respond differently, right? Each of us can, based on that community involvement and how much we believe and trust that the community idea or perspective is right. And then, of course, as we get to the point 18, 19, or even older, then we start looking at economic patterns. You know, can I make ends meet? I mean, the number of over 6 million people have been laid off since COVID, you know, and statistically, 80%, 60 to 80% of families are one paycheck away from poverty, right? Because of lack of savings and other things. But the idea is that the economic patterns also start to condition what I believe my lot in life is. And that will even create conflict between those who have and those who don't. As I said before, 2% of those in America own 90% of the wealth. So even that becomes an idea of conflict if you're someone without that says, there's Jeff Bezos, nothing against him, would love to come up with the Amazon idea. But if you're worth $160 billion and I can't pay my rent, that's a problem, right? And so then those views are supported and politicized and socially constructed so that it creates this barrier in our own development and how well we see the capability of our development. Cultural values, social conditions, all of those things play in. So Bronfenbrenner says, from the inside out, all of these influences affect our abilities to develop in a way that allows our needs to be satisfied. And as I said in the very first class, everything we do is a form of trying to satisfy our needs, however we define those needs. All right. So if we look at determining what kinds of social conditions, what developmental issues there are that promote this angst, that promote conflict, and even normalcy, then we have to look at conditions that promote whether it is valid or not. Now, again, since quite a few of you did not go through the Psych 200, I'm going to go through what a correlational study is versus an experiment. Very simply, a correlation is nothing more than a relationship between two or more variables. The key statement there is correlation is not causation. So simply because two variables have a relationship, it does not mean that one causes the other. It simply means that they react over a consistent period in a similar fashion or a dissimilar fashion. So if we look at correlations, there are three types of correlations. There is a positive correlation. There's a negative correlation. And there's a zero correlation. So a positive correlation simply says that two or more variables, have a change in their state moving in the same direction. So if two things over a consistent period both move or change their state consistently, then it's considered a positive correlation. So if there's an increase in whatever these two variables represent over a consistent period, they're positive. It's also a positive correlation if both variables decrease over the same consistent period. So as long as they're moving in the same direction, they're considered a positive correlation. If it is a negative correlation, then they are inversely proportional. As one thing increases, the other decreases. Again, it's over a consistent period of time. If it is a zero correlation, then as one thing moves, the other can move, but it is not consistent. As one moves, there's no change in the other. So the idea that it must be over a consistent period and the change in those two variables must occur over that consistent period. So let's use an example. Ice cream you guys can join me at Baskin Robbins after this class. Ice cream and crime rate. So does crime rate cause a difference in ice cream sales? In your opinion? Type it in the chat room. Does crime rate cause a change in ice cream sales? Three. So that means the other people are asleep. Oh, there's 27, 28, 29. 33. Okay, cool. All right. So let's see what you guys said. Okay. Oh, I like Isabella and Emma's, they use the psychology response. It depends. Oh, everything does. Okay. Oh, Emma, I'm sorry. I just saw your note about behavioral genetics. I'll come back to it after we cover this. All right. So you're right. Crime rate does not cause a change in ice cream sales. It doesn't have anything to do with it. However, ice cream sales also don't cause an increase in crime rate. However, when do we see the highest number of ice cream sales? What period of the year do you generally see the largest number of ice cream sales? You can unmute if you'd like. Oh, well, you're already saying it. Okay, summer, right? Why summer? Yes, Madeline put it, because it's warm weather, it's hot, right? So think about it from that perspective. Again, they don't cause each other. Again, correlations are not causation, but ice cream sales increase during the summer, which means that there are more people out and about. Higher susceptibility to sitting your phone down and having somebody pick it up, your laptop, your iPad, right, your purse, whatever it is. But it also means if there are more people outside buying ice cream, that means that there are fewer people in their homes or apartments or whatever they are, which means they are now more susceptible to being burglarized. Right? So even though they don't cause each other, they are similar in movement because ice cream sales is due to it being hot and people mingling about. Well, crime rate is also due to it being hot and people mingling about. So you see a simultaneous movement in crime rate and ice cream sales, even though they don't cause each other. And that's the idea of a correlation, right? And we know that ice cream sales tend to remain consistent over the summer, so does crime rate. Then during the winter months, when more people are at home and less likely to be outside, crime rate also decreases, right? So if it moves in any direction at a similar rate over a consistent period, it's considered a positive correlation. Now, if I said that as ice cream sales increase, crime rate simultaneously decreases, it's an inverse relationship, and that would be a negative correlation. If I said that ice cream sales decrease, but nothing happens to crime rate, that's a zero correlation. Or if ice cream sales decrease or increase, and crime rate, when we look at the period that we're measuring, if it only happens once or twice, it is not considered consistent. So subsequently, it would still be a zero correlation. So positive and negative means that it's over a consistent period of time. If it's once or twice, it is not considered a consistent period. So it would be considered a zero correlation. Now, the difference between correlation and experiments is simple. Experiments look for cause. Correlations don't look for cause, experiments do. So an experiment looks for several things. It looks for the conditions, and if those conditions will consistently produce or cause the same result. Back to the idea of statistical significance. If 95% of the time, 97% or 99% of the time, I get the same result or outcome based on the same conditions, then I can pretty much surmise that the outcome was caused by those conditions. That's the difference. Correlation doesn't look for cause. It only looks for relationship. Experiments look for cause. So part of that is a representative sample. There are a few other things, and we'll talk about them briefly with regard to an experiment. Here are these. So I'm going to have, well, with an experiment, I'm going to have an experimental group. Actually, that's going to be too long to write. Type it. I'm going to have an experimental group. And I'm going to have a control group. All right, so I'm going to have an experimental group or a control group. If it's the experimental group, then the experimental group is going to receive, before you accept up to C, the treatment. Whatever it is I'm saying that is going to change the behavior or the nature of another variable, that is to call the treatment. The control group will not receive the treatment. That, let me move this a little bit. Okay, in the absence of that treatment is called a placebo. So the experimental group will get the treatment. The non-experimental group or the control group will not get the treatment. They will be given a placebo. So we look at two variables, and you must have always in an experiment, you must have at least two variables. So there's going to be the independent variable, the IV, and there's going to be the dependent variable, DV. The independent variable causes a behavioral change. The dependent variable is what changes. All right. So if I have a drug that I'm going to administer that eliminates headaches, what would be the independent variable in that scenario? What would be the independent variable?
Would it be the medication?
Yes, it would be the drug, because the drug is what's going to cause a change in the other variable, which is the headache. So the headache, or the change in the headache, would be the dependent variable, because the headache is what's going to change. And it's going to be in one of three states. The change is either going to increase the behavior, meaning you get a bigger headache because there's an adverse effect. It's going to decrease. Now it works and decreases the headache, or it stays the same. There is no impact. Okay. So with the experimental group, they get the treatment. So if I want to have a better idea that the outcome was not biased, then for you guys, since we've got 33 people, I would take 17 of you and put in one group, 16 in the other. And I would give half of the group the placebo, and I'd give the other half the experiment or the treatment. Well, if I give you the same pill, one of the pills has medication in it and one doesn't. And the reason I separate the groups is because I want to know, after the results are taken, did the people who were getting the treatment, did more of their headaches diminish, or the people who got the placebo, did more of theirs? If more of the people in the control group lost their headache, then I might assume that the drug is not as effective as I want it to be. If the experimental group, the ones who got the treatment, a larger number of those lost their headaches, then I can make at least an initial assumption that the drug works. The other thing that comes into play are called confounding variables. And confounding variables are simply those things that are outside of the scope of the experiment that can cause a problem with the experiment. And we try to control for those. So again, if we're looking at headaches, right? People could be taking other medication that doesn't interact well with the drug. Fluorescent lights. For some people, fluorescent lights will cause headaches. Someone may have a different constitution. So if I can consider as many things as possible that can affect the outcome of the experiment, then I try to control for those. For instance, someone who's taking additional drugs, medications or whatever, I may do a survey before the experiment ever begins and says, please disclose if there are certain medications that you're taking, because we know these will have an effect on the drug that we're going to use in the experiment. So we can control it and try to do the things that way. So that's a quick overview of why an experiment looks for cause. The last thing that I will offer in this area is, and I'll write it since we're already here, the difference between a true experiment and a quasi-experiment. A true experiment uses random assignment. And it's random assignment because if I am the one creating the drug, then I also know that I want the drug to work. So I may handpick the people to be a part of the experiment that I know it's going to work on. That way my results are going to be positive, I get published, and I become a millionaire. But if I want to eliminate that bias, then I want it to represent a general population without there being any selection. And so I use random assignment to pick the people who are going to participate. That's a true experiment. A quasi-experiment, because I know specifically what the population is that I want to test. And the example I used, not with you guys, but with another class, was hair growth treatments. Because certain chemicals work differently with estrogen than it does with testosterone, some companies are adamant that if you are, using women's hair treatment, don't take it as a man. And if you're using men's treatment, don't take it as a woman. So if I know those two populations exist, and I know specifically that I need men and women to test my new drug for hair treatment, then it's a quasi-experiment because I am going to select people that I want to be in the experiment. All right, so sometimes that happens. But if I use random assignment, then it's a true experiment. If I don't, it's a quasi. Okay? All right. Okay, so then that's again representative sample. And naturalistic observation is a way to do an experiment. Again, and I can't remember if we talked about Jane Goodall, but Jane Goodall is the foremost authority on gorillas because she didn't go to the zoo and observe their behavior because it was an unnatural environment. She went to the jungle for 2 years and literally lived in the jungle. And as a result, she observed the gorillas in their natural habitat. So of course she was able to see the things that they do based on genetics and based on nurture conditions. So that's the same here. If I want to watch the interaction of a family or a foster home or something like that, then I want to go to the home. I don't want to look at them in the mall when people are on their best behavior. Sorry. Okay. And we talked about this, the true experiment, so you have that. Excuse me. Self-report is just that. This can be therapy, right? One of Freud's ways was free thinking or free association, was simply that the person knows best what's bothering them. And so if that's the case, then it may simply be a matter of trying to look at a condition and asking that person to explain the effects of that condition, as opposed to creating a condition that will cause it. We simply go naturalistic and ask them to self-report. Okay, so we won't go through those. Those are self-explanatory, you can read those. All right, so again, here's the idea of an experiment. Participants, if we were to use a group of first graders, random assignment on different conditions. So I may, for instance, to do random assignment, oh, there was something I forgot, I'll cover that in a minute. But if I wanted to do this random assignment, and let's say I did it for our class, I could take a deck of cards and I would take 33 of those cards, since there are 33 students. And if you walked into the class, I would give each of you, I would mix them up, but each of you would grab a card. And then I'd take another deck and I'd take the same 33 cards. If I want an equal distribution or equal probability for everybody to participate in the study, I might say I'm going to pick 13 people at random. So since you've got 33 cards, each of you has a card, I take the other deck and shuffle it, and I pull out a card, and I pull out the first 13 cards. Whomever has those same 13 cards participate in the study. Well, that means all 33 of you had an equal probability of being selected, and it was at random because nobody had a bias, and that's the idea. The thing that I forgot to share with you, and I will share now, and it's along the same lines, is whether it is a single blind or double blind study. A single blind study is actually pretty simple. They're both simple, but an explanation. So let's say that I have the researcher, and that researcher has 4 people in the experiment. So she has selected 4 people. So of those 4 people, 2 will be in the control group and 2 will be in the experimental group. Now, if I look at this as a cross section, very good cross section, but this will be. So the researcher is one section, the participants are the other section. In a single blind study, only the researcher knows who's getting what. So the researcher knows who's getting the placebo, and the researcher knows who's getting the treatment. That's a single blind study. In a double blind study, there is still the researcher, there are still the participants. However, in a double blind study, no one knows who's getting what. So the researcher nor the participants know who's getting the placebo or who's getting the treatment. Now, one of the ways that that can occur, it's not the only way, but one of the best ways that I have seen is that if I take a box and let's make it better. If I take a box and in that box, let's see, for our class it's 33 people. So let's say all 33 are going to participate. So I create 33 vials. And out of those 33 vials, since I know that there are 33 people, I'm going to have my treatment and I'm going to have my placebo. So I'm going to put 17 placebos in 17 vials. I'm going to put 16 treatments into 16 vials. What I will do is I will identify the vials using a barcode so that no human being can read it without a machine. So each one of these is going to have a barcode. 16 of them will have the treatment barcode. 17 of them will have the placebo barcode, whatever that is. Once all of that's assigned, then I just mix up all of the vials. Once they're mixed up, I don't know which one has the placebo and which one has the treatment. So now all 33 of you would simply reach into the bucket and pull out a vial. You would take the pill. One of those pills will have medication, one won't. But you don't know who's getting that, nor do I as a researcher know. Once you turn, or once let's say an hour later, I want to check the results. So I will say, let's see. So participant 1, bring up your vial. Did you lose your headache? Well, participant 1 had the box for the treatment. And as a result of the treatment, I look at the results and say, is that what I expected for the person who got the treatment? Participant 4 brings up her vial, and her barcode was for the placebo. I look at her results. Were those results what I expected from someone getting the placebo? Right? So once I get all 33, now I can simply read the barcode, associate that with the person that I didn't know who was getting what before, and then I can compare the results. Did the greater number of people who lose their headache or lost their headache get the placebo, or did they get the treatment? Was it equal, or did it matter, or did it not matter, right? So that's the idea behind a double-blind study. And so that's how the experiments tend to be administered. All right. In doing the experiment, again, we can do it a couple of ways. We can either do it so that we have a specific group of people, or we can do it in a way where we're looking at multiple groups. A cross-sectional study is just that. I want multiple groups. Insert a shape. I'll do this. So I want multiple groups, and those multiple groups are going to have something that I am testing across all three groups. So let's say I have a group of 20-year-olds. And I have a group of 30-year-olds and a group of 40-year-olds. All right, so what's something that I might be interested in as a manufacturer in how 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and 40-year-olds react? Okay, I'll give you an answer. What about cell phones? Right, because if you look at the iPhone 97, I mean, if you wear glasses, that thing is impossible to see. Well, when you get into the range, the 60 range, there's probably a higher probability that you're not going to buy something that's small and that you have to struggle to see or to read. And then even we just look at the technology associated with smartphones. A 20-year-old, if I'm looking at 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and 40-year-olds, and then because it's a cross-sectional study, I'm going to look at them over time. And maybe I do it for 6 months. And in 6 months, I look for the differences or the similarities for 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and 40-year-olds. Now, from a marketing perspective, organizational perspective, I can tailor my advertising and marketing and even products to the ones who are more likely to use my product, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, or 40-year-olds. Okay, so that would be a cross-sectional study. So we're looking at multiple groups over the same period of time. A longitudinal study is not terribly dissimilar. It's just that in a longitudinal study, I'm looking at a single group over a period of time. So instead of looking at 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, I may just look at 20-year-olds. But I look at them over a period of time. So what was significant when they were 20-year-olds, and now that everyone is now 30-year-old, what has changed? And then when they're 40-year-olds, what has changed? I mean, some of you may have already experienced that when you started with your first job, the only thing you could think about was making money. And then if you perchance had kids, then you started thinking, well, now it's not just about me and the money I have. Now I've got to change my values because I've also got to protect the family and take care of a family. And then, of course, you may get to the point in 30s or something, you buy a house. And it's like, now I've got responsibilities. I can't lose my job. I can't just quit now. I got to do other things. And then as you get into, hopefully, your 60s, and you get there and your home is paid for, and all of your kids are grown and out of the house, now it's like, man, I need to downsize. And I don't need to make as much money, right? So longitudinal studies allow us to look at a particular group over time to see what those changes are. And part of developmental psychology is that, what is different between being a child versus an adolescent versus a late stage teenager versus a young adult, middle adult, late adult. So that's the idea. The problem, though, as with anything with longitudinal studies, the American Psychological Association has its own ethics. And part of those or some of those are that any person who, first, the person must acknowledge and accept the requirements of the experiment. Two, the psychologist or the researcher cannot do anything that will willingly cause harm to a subject. And if there's going to be a susceptible harm, then it must be disclosed before the experiment starts. And another is that anybody in the experiment can, at any point in his or her period of performance, can decide and choose no longer to be a part of the experiment. Right? So if you look at a longitudinal study, people could move, they could leave, they could change their address, they could die, they could whatever. Right? So a longitudinal study is always susceptible to attrition, but it's still a great way of learning what happens over time and what changes the nature of how people do things. Okay, so quantitative versus qualitative research. Quantitative very simply has measurable data that can be manipulated mathematically. Right, so you effectively have numbers, and you have numbers that can be used to create value and differences based on value. Qualitative research tends to be more observational, and so it is more literal. Observing something and writing a description of it, doing a survey, doing a questionnaire. So those kind of things, using a Likert scale, from 1 to 5, strongly dislike versus strongly like. So qualitative research tends to be more phenomenological, meaning that it's more opinions and perspectives, where quantitative research tends to be more comparative because it's based on real data and measurement points. Okay. Oh, hallelujah. That is chapter 2. So, any questions? I know you got a long break coming up. Don't try to squeeze it in now. It doesn't come till Monday. Oh, and remember, for any of you who has a class on Monday, there is no class on Monday because it's Labor Day. So, don't try to get into a Zoom if you got a class. All right. So let's see. I promised I would go back because there was a question earlier that I did not respond to, Emma. So what examples of behavioral genetics? There are instances, yeah, it can be schizophrenia, it can be other mental disorders, but it can simply be as a result of the triggers in the DNA not triggering, right? There are proven cases when what is supposed to be periods when a child changes, when arms grow, when legs grow, when whatever it is, and all of those are as a result of certain triggers in the DNA process. And sometimes that trigger doesn't happen. A DNA strand is turned off when it was supposed to be turned on. There is, and I wish I had it, but I think they took it off of Amazon Prime. But there was a documentary on the first 9 months, and they literally showed the genetic separation and duplication and every week and day what happened for a child to be formed and then born. And there was one particular case where the young lady was, because the triggers didn't happen during the embryonic stage, she was bald, she had absolutely no hair on any part of her body. She had a partial cleft lip, and her nose was not fully deformed, and her ears were very, very small, almost non-existent. Now, all of that was simply because the triggers in her DNA strand, for some particular reason, went off kilter. And so those genetics didn't form properly. So now, as a result of that, she had a difficult life. Now, the good news to this story is she's now an international model because she embraced all of that difference and was able to transition that into a style. So she's okay. All right. But that's the idea. So behaviorally, our genetics can also influence our environment and our social construct so that it affects the way that we develop and how we develop. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Is there anything else? I thought there was one other example I wanted to give you, but it may have slipped my mind. No, I guess that's good enough for government work. Okay, guys. So there's only 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go into chapter 3. We will start chapter 3 on next Wednesday. Is it Wednesday? What's today? Wednesday? Today's Wednesday, right?
Correct. Today's Wednesday.
Today is
Okay, good.
Wednesday.
Okay, so yeah, and so since Monday is no class, we will start chapter 3 on next Wednesday.
Should
As well, I know the schedule has when the tentative exam date is going to be. However, if we need to push that based on the discussions that we're having, then I will let you know with enough time to reposition yourselves to not expect it on that certain date. It won't be more than a week after, but if, as a result of what we're covering in the chapters, does not go all the way through before the exam, I'll move the exam and we'll cover the information. But I'll let you know. Let's see. The assignment 1. What am I looking for? Assignment 1 is really a personality construct, and I will give you a personal example, and this is the almost last personal example that I'll give you. When I was growing up in the late 60s, 70s. So that was a period in the US when there was integration. When it became mandatory, there was no choices anymore. Prior to that, all minority students went to a minority school, elementary, middle school, and high school, and even college. Non-minority students went to a school that was all European, all white, elementary, middle school, and now, because of my academic ability, which may have been a flaw at the time, I was one of the first sent to be a part of the integration movement. So from the 5th grade to the 12th grade, I was the only African-American male in any of my classes. So it became huge for me to figure out how to fit in. So my personality was developed that I felt like the only way that I had value was to fit in. So I tried desperately always to have social acceptance, to be okay. I didn't want to be the different kid. Well, because of that, a lot of my academic performance, it didn't suffer, but it wasn't as high as it was supposed to be, or it could have been, because I was more concerned with being liked than doing well. And so for that large period of my life, it influenced my need for social acceptance. And it wasn't until I was around the age of 21 that I realized that I was just as important to me as other people's thoughts about me. And so using that as an example, when you talk about who you are, now you don't have to get too personal with this stuff, guys, you really don't. But there's a reason that you are as you are, you act the way you do, you married the way you did, you had kids the way you did, the reason you went to college, the reason you didn't initially go to college. There are a lot of things in your background that led you to being the person that you are. So I simply want you to apply this developmental psychology. And what were some of the things that influenced you becoming the person that you are now? That's what I'm looking for. And again, I'm not looking for a dissertation. It's a couple of pages that are double spaced. So I'm just looking for an idea of how you see yourself and why you believe the person that you are either has issues, has flaws, don't have any, have self-confidence, have the absence of self-confidence, why you're pursuing a degree or not pursuing a degree, whatever that is, you choose. That's what I'm looking for. So you're not necessarily talking about somebody, you're talking more situational. You know, what was the environment? What was the culture? What was it? If you want to talk about somebody specifically that influenced, you can do that. Because as shared before, I am the only person who's going to read these papers. Nobody else in the class has access to anything that you submit to me. So I will be the only one who reads whatever you write. Let's see. You can look on the schedule to see when it's due.
Dr. Humphrey,
Yes, ma'am.
I just have a quick question. I know the exam is on the end of September, like 23rd, and I thought I saw in the syllabus that it's going to review chapters 1 to 4, but you said that we will start chapter 3 next Wednesday. Are we still going to review chapter 2?
Yeah, no, that's why I said just recently, if the exam is scheduled prior to us finishing the material that I had planned for the exam, then I'll move the exam.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, any other questions, folks?
I just wanted to make sure. So the assignment is pretty much just like how you see yourself and why you think you are the way that you are.
Yes, ma'am. That's
Okay.
it. That's it. And there are no judgments, right? Because whomever you are, I don't have any insight into how you became that way. But I think from a developmental perspective, if you, I'll give you this last thing. It's not really an example because it's a real life situation that I've been dealing with. There's a young lady who has experienced trauma the majority of her life. Her father was abusive. Her first husband was abusive. And even after she divorced, her next boyfriend was abusive. And she's been having nightmares to the point that those nightmares, she has hurt herself because she's fallen out of bed. And I mean, literally in one instance, hit her forehead and put a gash in her forehead. And she had no idea why she's having these nightmares and is causing these responses. So what I asked her to do, when she let me know what I asked her to do, I said, I would like for you to go back to the very first thing that you can remember about your father and his abuse. Now, in some instances, I won't do that with people because sometimes it can be traumatic for people to go back that far. But because I know some of her background, I want her to look at all 3 relationships that she had and to do a comparative, why she believes they were as they were. And then the second is why she absolutely didn't deserve to be in those kinds of situations. And I think what it will do, if she addresses the violence that was in her life, it will minimize her need to relive them in her subconscious and her dreams. So for some of you, because it's developmental, I think looking at that as we talk about different things in the class, it will give you a different perspective. And that's the only reason that I'm doing that particular assignment. Okay? All right, so let's see. I think Vex, I would say both. They are not equal in that we will talk more from the PowerPoint than the book, but they are equal in that everything in the PowerPoint is from the book. The other piece of that is that as you saw with experiments and correlations and all of those, I've taken you further than what the book is going to represent. So I would pay attention to the slides and the lectures. And I think those 95% of the time will make you successful through the class. So that would be my response there. Okay. All right, guys.
Can I
I'm
just
sorry.
ask another question? I just wanted
Absolutely.
to make sure. You said we can talk about somebody else who's changed who we are, correct?
Well, you can talk about what their influence was, but I want it to be about you. I don't
Okay.
want it to be about them. So don't talk about how their life was and how they became who they were. You can talk about how you became who you are as a result of their influence.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep, so you can do it that way.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Any others? All right, guys. Well, you got a long weekend coming up, so enjoy, have fun, and I will look forward to seeing you all on next Wednesday. Ciao.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good
Okay, but you're welcome.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Take care. Thank you. All right. You good, Chrissia? Okay. All right. We'll see you later.